Hello and welcome to Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Joining me today is Trevor Tombe, who is an associate professor at the Department of Economics and a research fellow at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Thanks for joining me today, Trevor.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
Well, the School of Public Policy put out a report today on interprovincial trade costs and international trade costs. Let me just ask, first of all, an open-ended question. What do you think are the key findings from that report?
Sure. So it's long been known in Canada that barriers to trade between provinces is a drag on the strength of our economy and productivity. And what that translates into is lower levels of income generally for Canadians in many, many sectors. And there are lots of causes of those trade frictions between provinces, and infrastructure capacity to ship goods from one province to another. That's an important factor and very important for some sectors. So what we did through the School of Public Policy, myself, Alaz Manzoor, and Ken Fellows, investigate the potential gains to Alberta's economy from expanding infrastructure to facilitate exports out of Alberta. And we don't just mean pipelines, we mean infrastructure generally, and rail in particular. Rail is an important source of transportation of goods that we ship out of Alberta, and it's particularly important for some important sectors like agriculture, for example, or petrochemicals. So what we do is we try to quantify what are the costs involved in shipping by different modes, road, rail, and so on, and compare them over different distances, and then try and think about how much export costs would fall if we had expanded rail capacity. And what we find, I'll just highlight one kind of big takeaway result, is that if the amount of our exports, the share of exports that were sent out by rail increased by just 10 percentage points, then that could potentially boost Alberta's GDP by about 1.5% in the shorter term and 2.5% in the longer term. So equivalent to about $9 billion per year in economic activity. So pretty significant. And these large gains from increased interprovincial trade, that's well known. So what's new in the report is highlighting the particular gains that can be found for a province like Alberta from expanding lower cost transportation options like rail.
And I guess that becomes even more critically important this day and age, right, with where the province, especially Alberta, is struggling, right, financially and in terms of a revenue perspective, become more important now than, say, a few years ago when revenues were coming in, were flowing pretty constantly, right?
Well, I would separate the provincial budget challenges from its broader economic challenges. So the large deficit that we face in Alberta, unlike many other jurisdictions, has almost nothing to do with the economy as a whole. Much of our revenue is raised through instruments that aren't really as directly connected to economic activity as other provinces. So investment income is significant in Alberta. Oil and gas resource revenues are significant in Alberta. So increased interprovincial trade is not necessarily, and I would say really not even close to the solution to our budget challenges, but it would boost economic productivity and therefore incomes, and in some cases, in some sectors, employment. And to the extent that measures like this help facilitate a recovery from what has been a pretty difficult few years and a particularly bad past year thanks to COVID, it really does increase the value of thinking about ways of boosting our productivity. And that goes for Alberta, but it applies nationally as well. I mean, for the country as a whole to think about ways of boosting productivity has a lot of value, especially as we're coming out of a recession.
Yeah. Let me ask you in general terms about these interprovincial barriers that have been around for a long, long time, and just even simple things like, we've had issues with beer, for instance, over the years, right?
Indeed.
Why have these been in place?
So it's not as though provincial governments, for the most part, are deciding on enacting explicit barriers to trade between provinces. So countries enact taxes on imports of goods and services from other countries. That's not what provinces do. Instead, the barriers to trade take the form of differences in rules and regulations. For example, it might be okay for a truck to have a certain wheel in one province, but not in another, or the wide load sign, it needs to take some form in Saskatchewan and a different form in Alberta, or beer bottle size standards differ from one location to another. So when rules differ, that makes it costly for firms to operate or sell into different jurisdictions. And then there's government procurement. Lots of, or I shouldn't say lots, many important goods, alcohol in particular, is sourced by often monopoly government-owned wholesalers. That's true in basically every province. And so when government procurement is biased towards local suppliers, that is another form of internal trade barrier. And then infrastructure. This inhibits our ability to ship between provinces, of course, and it's not as though governments may be lacking in their willingness to build infrastructure for protectionist reasons. It's just that potentially some of the gains have been neglected to date.
So I'm just curious, have you looked at this issue from an international perspective in terms of other countries? How does Canada compare to, say, the US, our neighbors down south, when it comes to this whole issue?
No, great question. And I'll turn to some really excellent work put out by a team at Statistics Canada, involving Jesse Tweedle, Mark Brown, and some recently published work where they try and quantify internal trade costs in Canada using a method that was adopted by researchers in the US. And so the US team, applying it to data there, finds that interstate barriers to trade are not significantly different from zero. That's not to say they're zero, but it's just we can't measure them with enough precision to conclude they're higher than zero. Whereas in Canada, we do get this significantly different than zero estimate. They find of about 7%. So the barriers overall are equivalent to about a 7% tax on the trade in goods between provinces, but in the States, close to zero. So at least that one piece of research does suggest that Canada has a more difficult challenge than the United States does. It's tricky to do this for different countries because many countries don't actually collect internal trade data. Canada's lucky to have some really good interprovincial and province and territory trade flow data from StatsCan.
Okay, super. Well, thanks very much, Trevor, for joining us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Okay, super. That was Trevor Tombe, who is the Associate Professor in the Department of Economics and a Research Fellow at the School of Public Policy with the University of Calgary. This has been Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on Megapix Media. Thanks for joining us today.